Have you ever considered what is the most important part of the body? Most people would say the brain, or the heart, or blood, something that we need to sustain life. However, in this tape, we're going to talk about another part of the human anatomy that we believe is a very, very powerful part. I'm Glenda Stansberry, and I'm here today to introduce you to Doug Manning. He is an author and a counselor and a speaker who has spent the majority of his life going around the country and helping people walk through emotional pain. Doug has learned that there's some very, very simple skills to helping people do just that. He's developed a theory called the 3 H's. It's a lot like the 3 R's we learned in school, a little easier to remember, and there's no test at the end of this tape. But he would like to share with you how you can help people that you come in contact through your work and in your life to walk through that journey by laying ears on them. And I would now like to introduce you to Doug Manning as he talks about the gift of listening.
I've been walking with a lady friend whose son died of suicide about 2 years ago. The first time we got together, I was making a speech in her city, and mutual friends connected us, and we went to lunch. Our lunch lasted 3 hours, during which time she poured out how she felt about the death of her son. The next time we got together, she said, "You know, after I got home, it dawned on me that you had listened to me for 3 hours." She says, "I'm past 40 years of age, and that's the first time in my whole life that anyone ever listened to me for 3 hours." At first I thought that was a compliment. But after thinking about it, I think probably all of us would have to say that, because we don't live in a listening society. We live in a telling society. The most powerful part of the human body is the ear, and I think I can prove that. Have you ever been angry, just really angry? I mean, stewing for about 3 days kind of anger. And finally you told somebody about it, and while you were telling them, you couldn't make it seem as bad as it was. And so you finally just said, well, you had to be there. What's happening to you is as you talk, you're bleeding off the anger. That's what you do with anger. Or have you ever been depressed, just really depressed, and you finally told somebody, and the next day you felt better? You don't know why, but you just felt better. That's the power of the ear. I even told one of the big-time TV evangelists that I was a divine healer. He wasn't overly impressed, and he didn't ask me to do anything. But one night as we were talking, I said, I'm a divine healer, and I said the difference is you want to lay hands on them, and I want to lay ears on them. And I really think the ears are the most powerful. You see, as we listen to people, we allow them to learn. That's how learning happens. All of our lives we've heard, you're not learning anything with your mouth open, and that's just not so. Most of the things we really know, we know because we had a thought, and then we shared that thought, and as we shared it, it became ours. You really know something only after you've expressed it and said it, and then it becomes real to you. You see, you can only remember 10% of what anybody says, but you can remember 90% of what you say while you're doing something. It's that expressing of it that makes it yours and helps you remember it. Ears also give insight. I've been a counselor for 30 years, and I do not understand it at all. I don't know how I can sit with my chin in my hand and grunt every once in a while, and people actually get better, but they do. And the secret of all that is, as they talk, they get insight into their problems. As they share, they work through and even find solutions. In the final analysis, everybody must solve their own problems. I can't solve them, neither can you. The best we can do is offer them a place to talk out and get insight into the solution for those problems. And when you've done that, you've been a healer. Ears also build relationships. You see, I don't think a person will ever leave a mate if they have good hands and good ears. If they'll hear you and touch you, you'll never leave, because the ear is that powerful. and they're listening to you means that much. Maybe that's what love is. Maybe love are two sets of ears getting together to actually hear somebody. Ears also open communication. See, one of the things I hear the most in health settings is that people just don't tell me anything. I rarely ever go to a hospital that somebody doesn't say, they won't tell me anything. Matter of fact, recent surveys show that the reason people sue doctors and hospitals, the major reason people sue them, is for information. They just don't believe they've been told the whole story. And oftentimes you even hear jokes about it. I met a nurse that wrote a book, and the title of the book was, If You Want to Know If You're Dying, Ask the Cleaning Lady. And of course the book was about the fact that nobody in a medical setting will tell me anything. That really isn't true. Doctors do talk to patients. I've heard them. I've been there when they did so. The problem is not that they don't talk. The problem is that they're not heard. And the reason they're not heard is the patient is so full of their own anxieties that they just cannot handle any other information. They're like a pitcher full of water. There's no room. You have to pour off some before you can put anything else in. And when we're dealing with patients in a hospital or in healthcare settings, the most important thing we can do is let them talk just a little. They don't have to talk much. But if a doctor would come in and simply say, how are you doing? Tell me what it's been like sitting here waiting while this operation's going on. Just let them talk a little. It's amazing how just that little bit opens up enough that then they can hear us. People will hear you after you've heard them. People can actually grasp what you're saying after you have laid ears on them. That's the power of the ear. Now, I don't have any quick way to make you a good listener. I do have some keys, and I'd like to share with you. The first key is kind of a weird word. It's called comfort. And really, it's the toughest part of becoming a listener. It's very hard to get comfortable just listening. We keep thinking we have to say something. We think we haven't done anything until we've said something. People who suffer a death will almost inevitably also lose friends. And that sounds cruel and sounds like it shouldn't be, but it really is. And the major reason they lose friends is the friends can't get comfortable just listening. They think they have to say something, and they can't figure out what to say. And so ultimately they leave. I have a friend whose son was killed in the Wichita State football plane crash that killed the whole team probably 20 years ago. Prior to that, there were 4 couples, 3 other couples, and he and his wife, who were so close they whipped each other's children, and that's pretty close. They went on vacations together. They did everything together. Today, if he's walking down the street and he sees any one of the other 3 couples, or if they see him coming, they'll walk across the street to avoid him. He not only lost his son, but he lost all 3 couple friends. If you talk to that couple, they would say, well, he just wallowed in his grief. Truth of the matter is, they went over there the night of the accident and they couldn't figure out what to say. Stood around and feeling the awkwardness of the situation, trying to figure out what to say and couldn't. And finally they said the very typical, we'll go now, but if there's anything we can do, please call. And of course went home hoping nobody called. And because that was so awkward, they dreaded going back, and the dreading going back led them to delay going back, and after they delayed a while, they got to feeling guilty because they hadn't been back. Then they had to get mad at him to justify their guilt. You see, if we're going to help people, we don't have to say anything, but that's hard to do. Nurses have one of the worst cases of this I know. I think when they put a cap on a nurse, they automatically inject them with a long-term guilt pill, because almost every nurse I talk to, they seem to have the very plaintive cry of there's just got to be more that we can do. I watched some oncology nurses mean more to my father than the treatments he took. I took him for radiation treatments, and he would get better on the way up the elevator to the treatment center. You could almost just see him come alive, because he knew when that elevator opened, he was going to walk into the arms of these wonderful nurses. It was like walking into a womb. They'd greet him, they'd josh with him, he'd tell them his story, and he told them the same thing every time he went over there, but it didn't matter. And they'd take him back and put the gown on him, and they just had a wonderful time of touching and listening to him and caring for him. About the same time, I had to do a conference for oncology nurses. And at the conference, in the share time, if you really boil down what they said, every one of them said, there's got to be more that we can do. And I said, you don't know what you're already doing. If you're hearing people and if you're touching people, go home and feel good. Because you're doing more than you ever know, and you're doing much that nobody else in the world will do. You're allowing them the healing power of the ear. People in grief and pain need what I call the 3 H's. They need us to hang around, they need us to hug them, and they need us to hush. Trust presence. Nothing takes the place of being there. That's what I mean by hang around. Trust touch. All people need hugged 8 times a day, but people in grief need at least 3 times that. Touch them. And trust silence. That's what I mean by hush. People that have been through grief tell me the ones who helped the most were the ones who were just there. Other people in grief say there were times when I wanted to clasp my hands over my ears and scream for the whole world to shut up. They just need us to be there and hold them. And if you do that, that's enough. The second key to listening is focus. Nobody ever became a listener accidentally. The only secret to being a listener is to just grab yourself with a nape of the neck every once in a while and say, I'm going to listen. The reason you don't become one accidentally is that we're not built for that. We're built for talking. Our minds will work 10 times faster than anybody can talk. So basically we have what I call a lot of downtime. Your mind is not being totally utilized. It's like a computer that's just running, but it's got a whole lot more capacity. Your mind has a lot more capacity than is being used. And the problem is then it is what you do with that downtime. And how we deal with that downtime determines whether or not we're a good listener. We need to ask ourselves, what do you do when somebody else is talking? Most of us form our rebuttals. Most of us sit there and think up what we're going to say when and if they ever hush. I've asked a lot of people just facetiously, what do you do when somebody else is talking, just trying to get to that? And I found some interesting things. I found one lady that spells the last word in every sentence that you say. I found another lady that types what you're saying while you're saying it in some imaginary typewriter. And I found one lady that spells the last word backwards. I sort of line things up with my shoe. You know, I just, when your mind's just idling and you're just not there. You see, there are about 3 levels to listening. There's that idling where you're just not hearing anything. Then there's a second level, which is where you're hearing, but you're not really responding emotionally. And then there's a third level where you're really focused. Now, you can't be at level 3 all the time, and you shouldn't be. If you were there all the time, the intensity would absolutely scare most of your friends to death. But at least we can learn to be at level 2. We can at least be listening enough so that if somebody starts saying something with intimacy or meaning in it, we can pick up. Focus, you see, is beyond just listening. Focus is reading behind the lines. Not between the lines, behind the lines. Focus is focusing on one individual and trying to figure out not only what they're saying, but why they're saying it. And not only what they're saying, but what they're not saying. Focus is just exactly what it says. It is me concentrating on not only what you're saying, but who you are. That's focus. Now, at first, that's very awkward because we're not accustomed to it. But it does get better, and it gets better because what we're actually learning to do is to read people, and nothing is more fascinating than people reading. And as you get into it, it gets easier and easier and easier, and you get to where you can hardly wait for the next opportunity to focus, to read some more people. The other result of focus is it changes us. It makes us focus out here rather than in here. And that really changes us. There are a lot of people that are so inwardly focused that all they can think about is how does this affect me, and how am I perceived, and what's going on, and why. And if we can just train them to begin to focus out here, it's amazing what it does. I've even been very interested in shy people, because shy people see themselves as not as adequate as other people. And I don't think that's so at all. I think shyness is not a disease. It's a way you're made, and it's a wonderful way to be made. But I started getting together with some shy people just to understand that the phenomenon of shyness. Most people that are shy are born that way, and they ought to be that way. And we didn't try to quit being shy. But I thought, why not teach them to listen? They're already quiet. So we studied listening. And the strange thing is, it changed their focus. When they walk in a room, instead of being focused on how are these people seeing me, what if they ask me to say something? I don't have anything to say. They started walking into a room and looking the crowd over and saying, I'm going to figure these people out. And it transformed them. That's the power of the ear again, isn't it? And the third key is timing. It is not what we say, nor how we say it, it's when we say it. You can say anything you want to somebody after they know you've heard them and never, ever be offensive. Anything you say before you've heard them can be offensive, particularly people in pain, because they have their guards up and they're noticing, and when we respond, sometimes we can be very offensive. I visited with a group called Compassionate Friends, and one of the people said, you know what used to make me mad? And I said, no, what? And said, when people would come up and say, I understand how you feel, and I think you do not. And pretty soon, we went on around the room talking, and pretty soon one lady said, you know what made me mad? I said, no, what? She said, people would come up and say, I don't understand how you feel. And I think, here I have problems, you're telling me your troubles. Then they looked at each other and got tickled, because one said it made them mad if you did understand, the other one said it made them mad if they didn't. The truth of the matter is, neither of those are good statements, but you can make either one of them and not be offensive if those people know you've heard them. That's the power of the ear. That's especially true in conflict. And when you're dealing with anger, because you see anger kind of rises and then reaches a peak and then begins to come over. Let me draw it for you. Anger has a pattern. It comes up like this, and then it will begin to peel over and reach its kind of peak and then come down. And when it gets right here, you can say anything you want to somebody and never be offensive. Anything you say here just makes it worse. And of course the problem is that there's all kinds of things come up here that we think we just have to say. Your children will do that to you. You know, they'll start in on you, and they'll say 40 things right here that you just know you've got to rebut. Or else if you're not rebutting, you're going along with them and they'll think you're agreeing. Plenty of time, by the way, to come back later and say, hey, a while ago when you said that, that's really not true. But we jump in there. Anything we say here just makes it worse. That's so because, first of all, anger builds until somebody's sorry. And that's a problem when you're in a medical setting, because it's very hard to have anybody admit that it's their fault. We always say, well, that's not my problem. We pass it on and pass it on and pass it on, and it just builds as they come down the hall. But anger also reveals itself very slowly. People, when they come in and jump on you right here, they're not going to tell you what they're really mad about. They're going to tell you what they think is safe to argue about. People are like a mother quail. They act like their wing is broken to try to lead the dog away from the nest, rather than just telling you like it is. I did a very informal survey of nursing home administrators, and I asked them, what's the number one problem you deal with? You know what they said? Socks. They lost my socks in the laundry. You think about it. Here's some people that have this tremendous job of trying to care for all of the people, all the beds they have to take care of, and all the problems they have to take care of, and they're sitting around arguing with people over lost socks. Now, socks cannot be the problem. Those people were losing socks before that nursing home was built. I lose them, you lose them, we all lose them. So what is the problem? Let me give you an illustration. Here's a woman whose mother has had to become a resident of a nursing home, and she feels very guilty. Mother gigs her regularly. She really puts the guilt on her. She knows how to do it, and she does it beautifully. She has a couple of brothers and a sister who live out of state. When they come to see Mother, Mother has enough adrenaline that she seems to be very well when they're there, so they don't think she needs to be in a nursing home. And besides, they think if she has to go to nursing, instead of going to nursing home, she ought to live with sis. She has a husband who feels like that she's going out there too much because she feels guilty. She goes every day, and he fusses at her, and they haven't had any vacations, and he's on her case. So everywhere she goes, she's getting it put to her. One night, her brothers and sisters, all three, happen to call, and they put guilt on her. The next morning, her husband jumps on her because she wants a vacation and they can't have one. And she's already feeling about swallowed up in all of this. And she goes out to the nursing home and walks in, and her mother says, "They lost my socks in the laundry." And before she knows it, she's in the administrator's office bouncing off the walls about socks. And if the administrator responds, they have a wonderful discussion about the wrong things. In dealing in conflict, most of the time we have wonderful discussions about the wrong things. If he can let her talk about the socks and simply say, "I'm sorry," and simply understand, then it gets worse before it gets better. Because then she'll bring up all the other things that she's built up, all the other complaints. But if he can understand and simply say, "I'm sorry," gradually she'll begin to peak. And along about right here, he can say, my favorite statement is, "May I tell you what I'm hearing you say?" I like that because it's so non-threatening, and because you're saying, "I've heard you." Along about here, he can say, "May I tell you what I'm hearing you say?" And she'll usually say yes. And then he can say, "What I'm hearing you say is, you're really having a struggle with your mother being in here, aren't you?" "Yes, I am." Then they can deal with the real stuff. Then they can deal with the real hurt and the real pain after. It's timing. You can say anything you want to say after, but it better be after. There's a place for our input, but it's after. There's a place, if you're a clergy person, there's a place for prayer, but it's after. There's a place for us to explain to them how things really are, but it's always after. General George Marshall, World War II general, said that in dealing with conflict, there are 3 steps. Step number 1, let the other person tell their story. Step number 2 is let the other person tell their whole story. Step number 3 is let the other person tell their whole story first. That's the power of the human ear.